Hi everyone, I'm Scott Schneider and this is Stereo Niche. This week it's the Klipschorn on tube amplification, specifically the McIntosh MC75. Stick around. So let's talk about the Klipschorn on tube amplification. So before we get there, let's remind ourselves here on what I reviewed in the last video a bit, specifically about this set of Klipschorns. If you haven't seen the other video, there certainly are two. I just can't squeeze them into the frame here, but this set of Klipschorns is from 1982. And they've had some upgrades. The tweeter was upgraded with a Kreitz tweeter. And if you're not familiar, Kreitz is a third-party manufacturer of upgrades for speakers, specifically or mostly, I think, around Klipsch speakers. So this one has had an upgraded tweeter, and the capacitors on the crossover were also upgraded as well. As far as I know, that was the only noticeable changes. So it did. So let me review what I decided to do. So I originally did a review with my standard configuration, which is this gear here on this side, which is a solid-state McIntosh amp and some other components. And since the efficiency of Klipschorns is so high, which is a 105 decibels, which is very, very efficient. Versus something like an Advent here, which is only an 89 decibel efficiency, it made sense to set them up on some tube amplification because originally when Klipschorns were manufactured which was 1948 through the 50s and 60s, early 60s, then it would only have been tube amplification that was, powering them. So I thought, let's do that and let's talk about it. So I set up a separate system here just to do that, a couple of sources, a Marantz CD player, and my iPod for this go-round. The preamp is a gas Thalia preamp, which I very much like. It's a very straightforward, no frills type of a preamp. It seems to get the music signal from the source to the speakers with minimal, I'll say, intervention. It's very open, non-veiled, if you will, and so it it has a much different sound signature than the Pioneer preamp. It is just, again, seems to allow the signal to get straight to the speakers, without any nuances. So, I very much like this particular preamp for that sort of scenario. On the amplification side, it's my McIntosh MC75 tube amps. These are recapped, but other than that, they're all original. And that's pretty much it. They're hooked directly to the Klipsch. On the prior, I do go through a speaker switcher in the back for when they're on solid state, but in this case, they are directly to the speakers. So how did they go? What were the differences? Well, the differences were quite significant. The solid state review I did, if you want to go back and see that, was very glowing. I very much liked it. The speakers are very, lively and exciting, and quite different on the tube amplification. So let's jump into it. So I'm going to start at the top on the high end and then work my way down to the low end. So what I caught first was the fact that the tweeter was much more subdued, much more than I expected. So oftentimes when the stereotypical thought process on tube amplification is that if you use tubes, it sort of smooths things out, sort of calms things down a bit. So which is why you'll hear a lot of times a suggestion, if you have some bright speakers, try them on some tube amplification and may calm it down. Well, in this case, it seemed to calm it a little too much for me. I kind of preferred the solid state, sound signature on this particular tweeter. So that got me to thinking, well, maybe the original tweeter would have been better. Maybe I would have preferred it on tube amplification versus the Kreitz, you know, vice versa. So maybe the original owner had a solid state amp and didn't like that sound, but then, you know, decided to swap out the tweeter. That's a speculation. I don't know the original owner, and I don't know who did it. So it's a lot of speculation, but I can see that that could have been a possibility. So that's how I felt on it. The high end to me while it's beefier and it does have a you know, sort of smoothing things out a bit, it was a little too laid back, to be honest. Moving into the mid-range. Mid-range was relatively unaffected, except for the soundstage is different. It's more narrower, and again, I did say beefier because it does, you know, it's just a more grunt, you know, to the sound signature overall to the whole spectrum. But on the soundstage is a little narrower, but it is a little more pinpointed instrumentation a bit. So I found that interesting. Still very pleasant on, you know, voices and things like that are much, you know, still very pleasant. I didn't have any real difference there. On the low end, it has more grunt. It did seem to get a little bit deeper. No change in the configuration or what I've done to the room, anything there. Just changing the amp, it did seem to have a little more grunt to it. So, you know, those aspects did come through. Overall, I prefer them on my solid state amp than I do on the tube amplification. Now, if it had its original tweeter, maybe that would be quite different. Maybe they would be more pleasant or more flexible in their configuration if they had the original tweeter on a tube amp. Because again, it was a little beefier on the low end, so that might help address some of the lack of my ability in this case, or in many others, to set them up appropriately in a corner in a room. So maybe the change in amplification would help, you know, in that regard. Can't say for sure. I don't have the original tweeter, but if I did, I'd swap it in and just to see if there's a difference there. But in my case, that's what I experienced. I would on this particular set with this configuration, I would be listening to them only with my solid state amp. So I think it's quite an interesting comparison. It does show that your, you know, up-chain devices do have an effect and an impact on the sound downstream. So we talk about that a lot, but it's a pretty hard thing to quantify because, you know, not all of us, even myself, I don't have the time to swap in every single preamp and every single amp and figure out every combination. There's just far too many. But what we can say is that, yes, there is a difference in the amplification side of things, in the preamplification side of things. There is a sound change. And hard to say whether, you know, my experience on this particular setup with this particular speaker, you know, will be duplicated with a different speaker. You know, I don't know. I feel like I'd have to go through that as well. I'm speaking more in generalities here. But anyway, that's my impression of what I experienced on this particular setup this week. So let me know, you know, your guys' thoughts. I'd appreciate it. I know there's folks out there that have, you know, had these upgrades. You know, what did you experience, and what was your impression if you have had the opportunity to put them on tube amplification versus solid state? You know, how did that go for you? So put those notes in there. I appreciate the dialogue. I've got some other things coming up. I'm sort of, you can't see behind the camera here, but I have some stuff I'm about to swap around pretty drastically. So stay tuned. And if you guys don't want to miss anything, hit subscribe. And thank you guys for tuning in.